So last week with melody, we learned about scales and keys using only the black keys and only the white keys on the keyboard. We talked about the distance between the notes in terms of their relationships of whole tones and half tones, or tones and semitones, or whole steps and half steps. There's a lot of different terminology here. The other most important one to think about is major and minor seconds, where major is generally the larger or the more bright interval, whereas minor is the smaller or darker interval. So what we're going to focus on for today is that last little bit of information. We're going to go really, really deep into intervals and what intervals are, how you can represent them, and how we use them to build up everything else that we use in harmony is going to be built off of this. The smallest interval, the smallest building block that we have is a second. And this is going to be any note to any other note that is directly beside it. And we can look at this on kind of two axes in a sense. You have the minor second, which we just talked about. This is the same distance as a half step or a semitone. And it can also be the distance of a whole step or a whole tone, which is moving from C to D. Above that, we get into the range of what we would call leaps. A step is going to be any neighbor that is within that range of one whole tone or one whole step. Once you get beyond that, you're getting into what we would define as disjunct motion. Just as a bit of kind of a stepping back, because I realize this might be important, we're going to divide all of these intervals into two categories. Conjunct, aka stepwise motion, and then we have disjunct or leaping motion. These are the classifications for every single interval we have in an octave. For conjunct, as I just mentioned, it's anything that's less than a whole step or a whole tone. So this would be the major second and the minor second. I'm drawing that with a lowercase m. This would be the distance between C and B, or the distance between C and what might be more clear is C sharp. I did it the wrong way around. Excuse me. So we're gonna flip this real quick. This is gonna be the minor, and then this is gonna be the major. I realized I messed it up a little bit. So this is the minor, and then this is the major. This is the distance between C and D. There we go. Apologies for that. Anything else is disjunctive motion. It's leapwise motion. Now, we count in an octave 7 distinct notes. We can classify those as major, minor, or perfect, with one exception. There is one exception to this rule, which we'll get to at the very end of this. I'm going to skip over a number, and you'll notice that. Not a number, we'll skip over a note. But for all of these, it's going to be, whether you're going up or down, a leaping motion. Obviously, after seconds, you would have thirds, major and minor, or minor in this case and major, which we would classify as the distance between C and, I'm going to change the way we view these real quick. Instead of saying D sharp, we're going to say E flat. Now, I'm going to explain sharps and flats in a little bit. I wanted to go over intervals before we even started worrying about this concept in more detail. Whereas a major third is going to be the distance between C and E. Now, you will notice that for the rest of this sequence, minor intervals are going to be relating to these altered notes, the notes that have these weird little symbols following the letter. All the major intervals are going to be completely untouched in relationship to our root note of C. The fourth does not exist as a major or minor. This is one of two special notes in the distance of an octave. There are some other interval distances, which we're going to get to at the end, that are also in this classification, but for now, just think about fourths and the next one, fifths, as existing in this space of perfection, where we have a perfect fourth. That's the distance of C to the note F. Then we have something here that I'm going to label with question marks. And then we have the perfect fifth. The perfect fifth is the distance between C and F. Now, I'm not going to go too deep into why these are called perfect, but we will address that once we start talking about the concept of enharmonics, which will probably be how we end this particular topic today. Now, after these two, we're done with perfect intervals. We have the minor and major sixths. That would be the distance between C and what I'll call A flat. I'm actually going to keep these all consistent for now, just because I think this is important. We're going to call this now D flat. And there's a specific reason. Going back, there's a specific reason I'm doing this, and it'll make sense when we talk about enharmonics, and it'll also help us get to this thing right here. So the major six is just C to A natural, I'll call it. And this sequence will continue where you have now the minor seventh and the major seventh. And can anyone guess what note comes here? I'll tell you that this, the major seventh, goes to the note B. So what note is our minor seventh in relationship to C? Looking at the trend we have for all of these major and minor intervals, we have B flat, flat being this little lowercase b symbol that I'll explain in just a moment. Now, there are technically two intervals I haven't gotten to. One is kind of a secret conjunct motion, and the other is a secret disjunct motion. And the reason why I saved those for this point is that they're very special in that they are the same exact note. The conjunct version of this is going to be called the perfect prime or the perfect unison. I'm going to notate it with a P1. This is the distance between C and the very same C. This is the same note. I'm going to put a little 0 right here, just so that it's a bit more clear. Think of this like if you've ever worked with mathematics, the concept of an exponent, where if you have like 2 squared, it's the same as saying 2 times 2. And if you're looking at 2 to the power of 4, that's 2 times 2 times 2 times 2. You can also look at it as a base in the case of tens, where 10 to the 1 is the same as 10. 10 to the 2 is the same as 10 times 10, etc. So if you have like 2 times 10 to the 1, that's going to be 20, because it's 2 times 10. 10 to the power of 2 times 10 to the power of 2 is the same as 2 times 10 times 10, that's 200. We're going to borrow that concept to explain these 2 special case intervals, where the perfect prime, or the perfect unison, says C2. Oh, thank you so much. I must have labeled that. I appreciate you letting me know. So the perfect fifth is the distance between C and G. Good eye, thank you so much. I don't know if I said that. I feel like I said that. Perfect fifth is C to G, but I appreciate that. So circling back to the perfect prime, this is going to be C0, which is C at our octave. And then we have C0. Now down here, below the major seventh, we have another iteration of this, where we will have the perfect octave. I'm going to notate this with a P8. This is the distance between C at this octave to C 1 octave higher. This would be the distance between this note and that note. Now, if I'm up here and I play this note again, I'm not playing a perfect octave. I'm not playing the perfect 8, in a sense. I am now switching from this perfect octave back to the perfect prime. So this is why I saved it for the end. It's a bit special. And now that we know about perfect intervals, about major and minor, we can figure out what to do with this little blank spot right here. Now, if there are perfect intervals, this, in essence, implies the existence of imperfect intervals. Now, if we're just in the key of C major with C, D, E, F, G, A, and B, before going back to, C again, if there were no other options, if these were the only 7 notes we had to deal with ever, there was no other notes, we could consider these all perfect, because there is no way to make them imperfect. There's no secondary quality that they could have. Thankfully, we have these special little divisions right here between all of these notes. Even if there isn't a note on the keyboard, these notes exist. Between C and D, you have this special note that sounds like that. If we're considering C a perfect interval and D a perfect interval, well, how do we get to that note in between of C and D? Well, what we could do is we could start on C and we could raise it by 1 semitone. Alternately, we could start on D and we could lower it by 1 semitone. Now, raising and lowering, that's fine, but we can make that language cooler, right? We could come up with a better way, because we want to be able to notate it somehow. So this is going to be in between either a C something or a D something. Now, we can't call this a C raise, a C high, a C bigger. Those are all kind of weird, but someone somewhere in the past decided that when you raise some interval, some note, you are sharpening that note, or sharpening if you want to try and make it sound a bit more fluid. And we notate sharp with a little pound sign or a hashtag. This little thing right here, this little hash mark, is a sharp. So when you take C and raise it by 1, you get C sharp. We notate it like that. Now, When we lower something, we can't call this a D lower, a D smaller, a D shrunken. Someone somewhere decided that we're going to say you are flattening or flatting the note when you lower it by one semitone. So we notate that with this little italicized lowercase b, as I call it. It looks kind of like this. Try one more time. There we go. Nope. A little bit sharper. There we go. So this right here is called a flat. All these in between notes have two forms, C sharp and D flat. Between D and E, you have D sharp and E flat. Whoops, I almost spelled out E flat. E flat. Try one more time. E flat. Got it. Third time's a charm. And now, what about this right here? What note is in between E and F? So let's go back to the computer keyboard, or the piano keyboard. So I'll play C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. So what note is in between these two? On the piano, there's nothing there. In the, what we'll call sonic realm, the space of audio, of sound waves, there is no note in between them. However, we still need to be able to raise and lower, sharpen and flatten our notes. So, you take E and you raise it one semitone to get E sharp. Alternately, you take F and you lower it by one semitone to get F flat. So instead of actually having a division there, we would just go under here. We would have F flat and E sharp. There's one other case of this with B and G and C, where there is no note between B and C. But you take B, you sharp it, you get C, B sharp, even though you're playing C. C, you lower it, you get C flat, even though it's B. So with all of this information in our heads, with all of this stuff, what is this note right here? What is this note in between the perfect fourth and the perfect fifth? Because now we know you can raise or lower any note to get an imperfect version of it. And because we have some that are so ubiquitous in the scales that we just treat them as major or minor, what's right here? So you take the perfect prime, you raise it, you get the sharpened version of it. We typically call this augmenting. If you're taking something and you're extending it one more distance, you're augmenting it. So if you go from C to C sharp, you have an augmented prime. If you take C, if you take C and you lower it to C flat, you get a what we would call diminished prime. Because diminished is where you take an interval and you shrink it by one more from however far it can go. If we take this perfect fifth and we diminish it, we turn it lower, we flatten it, we would be going from C to G flat. And we could call this a diminished fifth. This is probably the most common version you'll find of this interval is going to be, we're going to label it with a lowercase d5. And now I'm leaving space for a reason here, because if we go the other direction, this is the less common form in my experience, but it still happens, where you take the perfect fourth and you augment it, you sharpen the note you go from C to F sharp, and you get, let me draw that out, the augmented fourth, which I'm going to do with actually with an uppercase A, just to help distinguish between major and minor. Bigger ones are always going to be uppercase, smaller ones are always going to be lowercase. Now, these two right here refer to the same exact interval. Like Shroom is saying, you usually will see these not written out in shorthand. You'll usually see like AUG 4 or DIM 5, but just for shorthand purposes, I'm putting it in here. So this kind of dual quality requires us, or encourages us, in my opinion, to pick a better name, something that conceptualizes this nice and simple. The name that someone came up with a while back was the tritone. So I'm going to label this with a TT for tritone. Now we have every single interval represented, but we actually haven't. Because now we get into some really fun stuff that I've kind of been putting off. Because if you noticed, this is now the first time in this new list, once I change this to D flat, that we're getting the hashtag back. We're getting the sharp symbol back. We can do this process to any other note. In order to do that, we need to start looking at this concept, this idea where two notes can share the same pitch, the same sound, or the same frequency, in a sense. In certain systems, this is not the case. In a lot of older styles of music, before we got to our, what we would call equal tempered system, our 12-tone equal tempered scale, there was in fact a difference between C sharp and D flat based on the instrument that you're playing and the tuning system of that particular instrument. We don't have to worry about that. So what we're dealing with is something called Harmonics. In its basic form, you can look at it as the black keys on the keyboard. We have the note between C and D, which could be divided into C sharp and D flat, as I mentioned, the note between D and E, the note between F and G, the note between G and A, and the note between A and B. I mentioned we can get to special versions of the prime intervals, either the perfect unison or the perfect octave. And we can also move between the notes E and F, or B and C, to get special notes, notes that technically don't exist. That's where you get C lowered between C and B. Even though there's no key, there is a C flat. Again, when you lower an interval from its most complete form, large or small, you get a diminished interval. What happens if you diminish a major interval? Well, C to D is a major second. You diminish that, you get D flat. What if you take a minor interval and you diminish that? Well, you get a diminished whatever it is you have. So, if you have C and D, D is your major, you lower it by 1, you get D flat. That's the minor second. If we lower it one more time, we get D double flat. It's the same exact note as C, but we call it something different. We call it a diminished second. This is not super common, but it's going to become important as we start going into the next stage of using these intervals, which is triads and larger chord structures. You can go in the opposite direction as well, where you have D between D and E, between D and E, You can go raise D to get D sharp. And this is actually what we would call an augmented second. Even though it's the same exact note as E flat, and C to E flat is a minor third, because we're taking it from our major second, we are receiving an augmented interval. This is going to become very, very important when we revisit scales next week, because I'm going to start showing you variations on scales. If you're looking at E and you're augmenting that, you get E sharp, which is the same as F. But believe it or not, for both of these, you can technically augment a second time. You can technically diminish the second time as well, but we're going to focus on augmenting because in my experience, it's a little bit more common. So if we take D sharp and we sharpen that, this gets a little bit advanced. If this is confusing, don't worry. I'm just trying to show you that this is a bit of a rabbit hole. We actually get D double sharp. And while 2 Bs is not bad, 2 pound signs is really ugly. So instead, what we do for a double sharp, which you'll encounter very, very rarely, is an X. Sometimes with a little dot up and down. That is a double sharp. You can do that for all of these. When you lower a minor one, you get a diminished. When you raise a major one, you get an augmented. And that will allow you, harmonically, to build literally every single chord in existence by stacking any sequence of these notes on top of each other. Every single chord in existence is made up of some combination of 2 or more of these intervals. Now, intervals can exist melodically and harmonically, but I wanted to introduce them to you in this harmonic concept so that when we revisit melodies in about 2 weeks, you can take this information and start expanding upon it. So, to play these all out, we have the perfect prime, minor second, major second, take your default, the minor third, the major third, the perfect fourth, the tritone, the perfect fifth, the minor sixth, the major sixth, the minor seventh, the major seventh, and the perfect octave. The last thing I want to go over here is a very, very basic introduction to triads. In a scale, we can count up, as we just did, prime, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, and then the octave. Now, if you're stacking seconds on top of each other, to me, that's kind of a cool sound. It's very clustery, it's kind of crunchy, and it has some intrigue to it, but we don't really get much out of it. We could maybe start stacking, major and minor, major and minor, and major and minor. But then it just gets even more crunchy, even more mysterious. So rather than use conjunctive or stepwise motion, instead we build our chords off of the next smallest interval, the smallest leapwise motion we have at our disposal, which is a third, where you just take a note, skip a note in the scale, play the next note, skip a note, play the next note in the scale, skip a note, play the next note in the scale, skip a note, play the next note in a scale. Do the same thing there, do the same thing there, until you get back to your root. We're going to explain all of those things to start, or much later on. But to start, we're only going to focus on pairs of 2 triads. That's the only thing we care about, is this pair of 2 triads. You can also think of this as, or look this up, it's called tertian harmony. There are other ways of building chords, which we'll get to later. But for now, I want you to just focus in on just these 2 right here. We have major thirds and minor thirds. We technically also have augmented thirds and diminished thirds, but don't worry about that to start. For now, I want you to map out for yourself. I'm going to do it right now, but if you're watching this on YouTube, pause and do this yourself. I want you to map out all of the different combinations of major and minor triads. So, on this grid, we have first the smallest possible pair, a minor third plus a minor third. This is going to be called a diminished chord, and we'll explain why at the end. The next smallest, is going to be a minor third plus a major third. We're going to call this one a minor chord. The next smallest is a major third plus a minor third. We're going to call this one major. And then finally, the largest one of the intervals we have to work with right now is a major third plus a major third. And we call that one augmented. And this comes back to this thing right here. This is where things start to come into play, right? So let's look at these on a piano keyboard. A minor third is the distance from C to E flat. That's 1, 2, 3 semitones, not counting our starting note. Remember, when you're counting up semitones in terms of intervals, you do not count the starting note. When you're counting up in scale, you count the starting note. But when constructing intervals like this, ignore the note you start on. 1, 2, 3. Let's add another minor third. 1, 2, 3. Ooh, very tense. Very suspenseful. We call this a diminished third, or a diminished chord, because if we look at the very next sequence, which is a minor plus a major being the distance of 4 semitones, C to E, 1, 2, 3, 4. So if we do a minor, and then we count up 1, 2, 3, 4, we get to our minor chord, where we have our root, our minor third, and then in relationship to our root, a perfect fifth. If we lower that by 1, if we flatten it, we get G flat. We get the diminished fifth, right? So, the diminished chord. You swap the minor and major third placement, you get this. Count. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3. So, major and minor, you can think about as mirror images of each other. One is the brighter, and minor is darker. Major has lift, while minor has a feeling of kind of suppression, of pulling things down. And then, if you do that same exact sequence, but you raise the minor third to a major one, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, we get this chord, which is suspenseful and intriguing in its own way, but it has a bit more power to it. It's almost too bright. It's like looking into the sun. Very bright. And if you take a perfect interval and you raise it, as I mentioned, you get an augmented version of that interval. So even though this is a minor sixth, it is also an augmented fifth. So, there you go. So we call this an augmented chord. Everything else will be built on top of one of these four primary relationships of major and minor thirds. In 3 weeks, we are going to revisit this topic, and we're going to start building more off of our chords. We're going to start looking into the relationship between the chords. We're going to start talking about chords function in a scale, and we are going to, at the very end, introduce you briefly to this concept known as extended harmony, which is, kind of just to introduce you to it, it's where we do that third step beyond the first two. That is going to be about it for this. If you are watching this on YouTube, please be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Click the bell thing, do all that fun YouTube stuff. Check out my Twitch stream, that's where I do this every Thursday. Check out my Patreon. If you have any particular suggestions for what you would like to see on my Patreon, any sort of rewards, feel free to drop that in the comments. Check out my Twitter, join my Discord. Otherwise, that's where we're going to end things.